Hi, welcome to howtostats.com. In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to calculate the coefficient of variation in SPSS. Now I'm going to do it based on two different approaches, which are basically trying to answer two different questions. In the first case, I'm going to demonstrate how to calculate a coefficient of variation for each case. So in this example there are 10 items, and each person has responded to the 10 items. So each person would have their own mean and standard deviation. So how would we calculate the coefficient of variation for case 1 and case 2, 3, etc.? So that's one instance of analyzing data via the coefficient of variation. I'll show you how to do that. The other case, which is probably more common, is where you're calculating the coefficient of variation for a particular variable. And in this case, I've got data where scores were calculated from a 7-point Likert scale inventory versus a 7-point Likert scale inventory. And the question is, well, is one approach to measurement, they're measuring the same thing, they're all the same items, is using a 7-point Likert scale going to be associated with greater variability, controlling for the difference in the means. And if you're not quite familiar with the coefficient of variation, I'll encourage you to check out a video I've got. It's a more lecture-based video on the coefficient of variation. So if you don't understand it, please view that first and then view this video, because I'm assuming that you know what a coefficient of variation is. Okay, so in the first approach, where you're calculating a coefficient of variation for each case, well, fortunately in SPSS, there's actually a function that allows you to calculate that quite quickly. You just go into Transform, Compute, and I'm going to call it COV for coefficient of variation. Now, the function group that it is a part of is statistical, and it's this over here, CFVAR. So CFVAR will calculate the coefficient of variation for all cases based on the variables that you include in the brackets. So I need to do that for all 10 items that are in this scale. And 10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Alright, that's all you have to do, and that's going to calculate the coefficient of variation for each person, and it's going to be included as a variable called COV. So case 1 had a coefficient of variation of 0.41. Second person, 0.16, 0.19, 0.16. So we can see that there's variability in the coefficient of variation across the 100 people that are included in this sample. Now, so that's the first approach. If you need to calculate a coefficient of variation for each case, just use that function. In the second case, which is probably more common, it's where you want to calculate the coefficient of variation for a variable. So this total score, which isn't based on these 10 items, by the way, it's based on a lot more items, based on this total score 5-point Likert scale, there's going to be a mean and standard deviation associated with this, and there's also going to be a mean and standard deviation associated with the 7-point one. Now I'll actually calculate that just to check out what the means are, means and standard deviation, because that's how you would normally have to calculate the coefficient of variation, is you'd have to do it by hand. But I'll show you a trick on how to do it in SPSS so you don't have to do it by hand. So you'd have to use the standard deviation here divided by the mean, and then you'd have your coefficient of variation. Well, the way to trick SPSS into doing it, and I'll note before I continue that there's actually in the complex samples, there's actually an approach to doing a coefficient of variation much more. You don't have to do a trick. So if you have complex samples, just go into complex samples descriptives and you'll see quite clearly. I don't have access to it, unfortunately, but there'll be an option to actually click for the coefficient of variation. Now for the rest of us who don't have complex samples, you have to trick SPSS into calculating the coefficient of variation. And how you do that, the first step is to calculate a variable with a series of ones. Okay, so I'm going to call it 1. And this is how you create a variable with a bunch of 1s for each person. Alright, so here's that variable that was just created with a bunch of 1s. So everyone's got a 1 associated with them. Actually, it went beyond. It went up to 200 because I used to have a sample size of 200, but this is 100. So now I'm going to go into, now that I've got that, I just have to go into Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and Ratio. And that's going to this is